The year of our Lord 1879 was a thirsty one. It drew the color from the sky, leaving a pale, washed-out blue that offered no promise of rain. It baked the land of the Arizona Territory into a cracked red plate, and the wind served only to lift the dust from that plate and throw it in the eyes of God and man alike. The dust was a constant presence in Mesquite Crossing. It coated the unpainted planks of the buildings, settled in a fine red film on the water in the horse troughs, and worked its way into the lungs of every soul tough enough or foolish enough to call the town home. Abigail Bennett felt it grit between her teeth as she stepped down from the stagecoach. The journey had been a trial of jolting bones and stifling heat, but it was the dust she noticed first. It was an antagonist in its own right, a blinding curtain that seemed determined to obscure the truth of this place. She adjusted the heavy woolen skirt that was wholly unsuited for the climate and clutched the handle of the large, leather-bound case that held her photographic equipment. It was her anchor and her purpose. At 26, Abigail was the daughter of a blacksmith, and the weight of her gear felt more natural in her hands than an embroidery needle ever had. The war had taken her from her father's forge to the blood-soaked floors of a field hospital, where she had learned that life and death were simple, brutal things. Now, in its aftermath, she worked for a newspaper back east, chasing a different kind of truth, one she hoped to capture not with bandages and sutures, but with collodion plates and a lens. She was here to document the great expansion of the railroad, a story her editor sold as one of progress and manifest destiny. Abigail, however, had learned to look for the stories that lay beneath the headlines, in the spaces between the iron rails. Mesquite Crossing was a town balanced on a knife's edge. A white-steepled church stood at one end of the main street, its silent judgment cast down upon the swinging doors of the saloon at the other. Law was a suggestion, enforced by a man who seemed as weary as the land itself. Abigail saw him now. Sheriff Enoch Vale, leaning against a post outside his office. His face was a roadmap of compromise, his eyes holding the kind of tired resignation that comes from knowing which battles were lost before they even began. Her destination was the boarding house, a 2-story structure that looked as though a strong wind might carry it off. Its owner, Sam Ashby, greeted her with a weary but not unkind eye. He was a practical man, his face weathered by the sun and his demeanor sharpened by the daily calculus of survival. "You'll be the writer," he said. It was not a question. News traveled faster than the stagecoach in a town this small. "Room's upstairs. Water in the pitcher as fresh as it gets, which means it was drawn this morning." "Thank you, Mr. Ashby," Abigail said, setting down her heavy cases. The camera was her primary tool, but the smaller case held the glass plates, her journal, and a small, concealable dry plate camera, a newer technology she kept as a reserve. "Folks around here just call me Sam," he grunted, wiping the bar with a damp rag that did little more than smear the dust into streaks. "Not much to write about here, unless you're fond of heat and disappointment." "My editor is interested in the railroad," she explained, her gaze drifting out the window toward the faint, distant scar on the landscape where the new line was being cut. The triumph of industry. Sam gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's Harlan Pike's industry you're talking about. He owns the railroad, the land it's on, and most everything in between. He calls it progress. Others call it something else." The name hung in the air, heavy as the heat. Harlan Pike. Abigail had heard of him. Of course, a titan of commerce, a man whose wealth was paving a new road to the Pacific. But out here, his name sounded less like a pillar of society and more like a threat. "And what do the Apache call it?" Abigail asked quietly. Sam stopped wiping the bar. He looked at her, his expression guarded. "They don't get much of a say. Pike's been spreading stories, calling them savages, a danger to the railroad, to the good folk of this town. Makes it easier to push them off the land when folks are scared." This was the story Abigail had come to find, the one written in dust and fear, not in the triumphant ink of the Eastern papers. She knew the power of a narrative. She had seen how a few carefully chosen words could turn a man into a hero or a monster. Harlan Pike, it seemed, was a master of the craft. Later that afternoon, she walked the length of the town, the hem of her skirt gathering a fine coating of red earth. The air was thick with the smell of horse, sweat, and cheap whiskey from the saloon. She saw men with sun-scorched faces and hard eyes, women whose gazes seemed fixed on the distant, unforgiving horizon. This was a place stripped of pretense. Just as she was considering the angle for her first photograph, a rider entered the street, moving with a fluid grace that made horse and human seem one entity. It was a woman, clad in worn leather trousers and a loose cotton shirt, a wide-brimmed hat shading a face that was quick to smile. She handled her horse with an easy confidence. Pulling up in front of the general store, a pair of locals tipped their hats, and she answered with a laugh that carried on the dry air, a bright, clear sound in the otherwise muted town. This, Abigail guessed, must be Maria Ortiz, the Mexican vaquera she'd been told about, a woman who shot as straight as she spoke and acted as a bridge between the town's disparate cultures. Abigail lifted her gaze past the town toward the low mesas that shimmered in the heat, and that is when she saw him. He was a distance away, a lone figure standing beside a sparse juniper tree. He was too far to make out his features clearly, but his stillness was absolute, a stark contrast to the restless energy of the town. He was an Apache, she knew instinctively. There was a coiled tension in his posture, the watchfulness of a man who did not see the land as something to be conquered, but as something to be read. He wore a simple cloth band around his forehead, and a dark kerchief was knotted loosely at his throat. His eyes, even from this distance, seemed to burn with a low, steady fire, taking in everything, giving away nothing. This was Nantan. She did not know his name yet, but she felt his presence as a part of the landscape, as old and enduring as the Red Rock itself. He had been a scout for the army, a fact that sat uneasily in the minds of both the whites he had guided and some of his own people. He had done it. She would learn. For the same reason he did everything to protect the Chiricahua, to navigate the treacherous currents of the white man's world in the hope of steering his people to safe harbor. Their eyes met for a brief, startling moment across the dusty expanse. In his gaze, she saw no welcome, only a deep, penetrating assessment. He saw a white woman with a strange box, another harbinger of the change that was poisoning the water and scarring the earth. He saw a threat. Abigail saw a man who carried the weight of his world in his silence. The connection was broken as quickly as it was made. He turned, melting back into the landscape as if he had never been there. But the impression remained. He was the other side of the story, the one her editor did not want, the one Harlan Pike was trying to erase with steel rails and vicious rumors. That night, in her small room, Abigail unpacked her journal. The red dust had found its way in, a faint pinkish smear across the page. She wrote of the heat, of the sheriff's tired eyes, of Sam Ashby's cynical wisdom. She wrote of the shadow of Harlan Pike and the distant, rhythmic clang of hammers on steel. And she wrote of the silent man on the mesa. She thought of his neckerchief, a simple strip of cloth that, for some reason, seemed to hold a significance she could not yet grasp. She thought of her camera, its polished lens currently protected in its case, her instrument of truth. She was here to capture an image of the West, but she was beginning to understand that the most important truths of this place were invisible to the eye, hidden beneath a layer of blinding red dust. Nantan suspected the white woman's arrival was tied to the railroad, another piece in Pike's game. His people were being squeezed, their access to the last reliable spring threatened by a new survey line. Pike's men claimed the land was empty, that the Apache were violent nomads. Nantan needed proof to the contrary, something the white authorities would recognize. A photograph, perhaps. The thought was a bitter one. To trust a white person, to rely on one of their machines, felt like a betrayal of the ancestors buried under the very ground Pike sought to steal. But his people were running out of time. The whispers in Washington were growing louder. Talk of a final removal order. He needed evidence, and he needed it soon. And so he watched the town, and the woman with the box of truth, knowing their paths were destined to cross, likely in a storm of conflict and mistrust. The coming article in the Eastern newspaper could be the final nail in his people's coffin, or it could be their only salvation. It all depended on who controlled the story. 3 days of breathing dust and listening to the town's guarded whispers had given Abigail a foundation, but a foundation was not a story. The truth of Harlan Pike's railroad was not in Mesquite Crossing. It was out on the line, where the steel was being laid and the land was being broken. She booked passage on the morning stagecoach, a bone-jarring conveyance that ran a supply route to one of the forward survey camps. Her stated purpose was to photograph the grand endeavor, the heroic men taming the wilderness. Her real purpose was to see whose homes were being tamed along with it. The coach groaned and swayed, its leather straps complaining with every rut in the trail. Inside, a whiskey salesman mopped his brow, and a young couple held hands, their face pale with the anxiety of a new beginning in a hard land. Abigail sat with her large camera case held securely on her lap, its familiar weight a comfort. She watched the landscape pass, a monotonous panorama of red earth and skeletal creosote bushes under the vast, indifferent sky. The attack came with the suddenness of a lightning strike. There was no warning, just the sharp crack of a rifle, the whinny of a terrified horse, and the driver's raw shout. The coach lurched violently and tipped, throwing the passengers in a heap against the low side. Wood splintered, glass shattered. The salesman cursed, his voice a high-pitched squeal of fear. Through the dust and chaos, Abigail saw them, figures on horseback, their faces painted in harsh, terrifying patterns, whooping and yelling as they circled the crippled coach. They wore the buckskins and feathers of Apache warriors, their movements frenzied and aggressive. One of them shot the lead horse, a brutally efficient act that stranded them completely. Another ripped open the rear boot, scattering mail and packages across the thirsty ground. Fear was a cold knot in Abigail's stomach, but the instincts of her trade were stronger. Her mind was a camera, capturing the details, the way the sunlight glinted off a rifle barrel that looked newer than the rest of the man's attire, the strange, almost theatrical nature of their cries. Something was wrong. It felt like a performance. The door was torn from its hinges and a painted face loomed in the opening. He reached for her camera case. Abigail held on tight, a useless act of defiance. He wrenched it from her grasp and threw it to the ground, where another rider smashed it with the butt of his rifle. The sound of splintering mahogany and shattering glass was the sound of a voice being silenced. Her voice. Just as despair began to set in, a different sound cut through the air. It was not the chaotic report of the attackers' rifles, but a single, sharp crack from the ridge above them, followed by another. It was a sound with purpose. One of the false warriors slumped from his horse. Another clutched his shoulder, his painted face contorted in surprise and pain. From the cover of the rocks, 2 riders emerged. One was the woman Abigail had seen in town, Maria Ortiz. She sat her horse with an almost casual grace, a rifle held steady in her hands, her expression one of intense, focused annoyance, as if she were dealing with a particularly stubborn stain. The other rider was the Apache man, Nantan. He moved not like a man on a horse, but like an extension of the animal itself, guiding it down the treacherous slope without a sound. He carried no rifle, only a bow, and his eyes were fixed on the attackers with an unnerving, predatory calm. The fight, if it could be called that, was over in moments. The ambushers, faced with skilled and unexpected resistance, lost their nerve. Their performance of savagery crumbled into a panicked retreat. They fled, leaving behind the wrecked coach and their wounded. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the young woman and the pained groans of the injured driver. Maria slid from her horse, her rifle still held at the ready. "Well," she said, her voice dry as the dust, "that is one way to liven up a Tuesday." Nantan did not speak. He dismounted and walked not to the passengers, but to the ground, his gaze scanning the scuffed earth. He knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of a hoof print in the red dirt. He looked at the tracks left by the fleeing riders, then back at the print. Abigail scrambled out of the ruined coach, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her first thought was for her camera. She knelt beside the shattered remains of the case. The beautiful wooden body was splintered, the brass lens assembly bent and twisted. It was a complete loss. A wave of fury and helplessness washed over her. But then she remembered. Her hand went to her right boot. Tucked inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 6 prepared dry plates and the small, sturdy camera that used them. It was not the magnificent instrument she was used to, but it was a voice nonetheless. She stood up, her jaw set. Nantan was still examining the tracks. She walked over to him, her shadow falling across the print he was studying. "They were not Apache," he said, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. He did not look at her. "How do you know?" Abigail asked. He pointed a finger at the track. "This horse wears an iron shoe, a white man's shoe. The horses of my people are unshod. The men who ran, they ride with the heavy seat of a white man, not like the people." He finally lifted his eyes to hers. They held the same fire she had seen from the mesa, but now it was closer, more intense. This was a lie, written in the dirt. Maria walked over, reloading her rifle with brisk, efficient movements. A lie to make the town angry, a lie to make them thirsty for blood. Abigail looked at the fleeing dust cloud of the riders, then back at the wreckage. Her story had just ridden up and kicked her in the teeth. She felt a surge of indignation that burned away the last of her fear. "I need to follow them," she said. "I need to see where they go." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Señorita, you have a hole in your stagecoach and your fancy box is broken. I think you need to go back to town and have a drink." "I do not need saving," Abigail retorted, her voice sharper than she intended. "I just need a good angle." For the first time, the faintest hint of something other than suspicion flickered in Nantan's eyes. He stood up, his height surprising her. "A living person," he said slowly. "Can take more pictures?" The ride back to Mesquite Crossing was a somber affair. The driver was hurt, the salesman was shaken, and the young couple was reconsidering their future. All any of them could talk about was the savage Apache attack they had survived. Abigail tried to explain what Nantan had discovered, but her words were lost in the tide of their fear. They had seen what they were told they would see. By the time they reached the town, the story had already arrived, twisted and magnified into a tale of brutal massacre narrowly averted. Men poured out of the saloon, their faces flushed with whiskey and righteous anger. Voices rose in a dangerous chorus, demanding action, demanding revenge. "We can't let them get away with this," a man shouted from the steps of the general store. "Vale needs to form a posse, ride out and teach them a lesson," another roared. Abigail felt trapped in a wave of hysteria. This was how it happened. A lie, carefully planted, was watered with fear and whiskey until it grew into a justification for violence. She saw Harlan Pike's hand in this as clearly as if he had signed his name in the dust. She found Sheriff Vale in his office. He was listening to the story from the whiskey salesman, his face looking more tired and compromised than ever. Abigail pushed her way forward. "Sheriff, it was not the Apache," she said, her voice clear and firm. "The men who attacked us were white men, disguised." Vale looked at her, then at the salesman, then at the angry faces peering through his doorway. "Miss Bennett, this man here says—" "This man was scared," Abigail cut in. "The tracks do not lie. Their horses were shod. Nantan, the Apache scout, he saw it." At the mention of Nantan's name, a flicker of something, perhaps interest, perhaps just more weariness, crossed the sheriff's face, but it was quickly extinguished. "Nantan says a lot of things. The folks in this town, they're demanding protection. They're scared. They are being manipulated, Abigail insisted. The sheriff sighed. A long, rattling sound. He ran a hand over his face. Look, miss, I'll look into it. I'll ask some questions. But his eyes told a different story. They told her he would do nothing that might upset the delicate balance of power in the town. Later, as she was leaving, she overheard one of Pike's foremen speaking quietly with the sheriff. Mr. Pike was just saying the other day how he appreciates your work. Sheriff said that contribution he makes to the jailhouse upkeep is some of the best money he spends. The reminder was delivered with a smile that did not reach the man's eyes. Abigail knew then that the law in Mesquite Crossing was just another commodity to be bought and sold. If the truth was to be told, she would have to write it herself. That evening, she found Maria watering her horse at the trough. The vaquera gave her a shrewd look. You have the look of a woman who is about to kick over a hornet's nest. I need to find Nantan, Abigail said simply. I believe him, and I think he is the only one who can help me find the proof I need. Maria studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He is a man who trusts the earth more than he trusts people, especially white people, but he also trusts the truth. I will take you to him. They met as the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows from the mesas. Nantan stood waiting for them in a small, hidden arroyo, the place where he had brought his horse to drink from a seep of precious water. You came, he said. It was not a question. I am staying in Mesquite Crossing, Abigail told him. Getting straight to the point, I am going to write about what happened today. The truth of it. Your people will not listen, he said, his voice flat. They hear what they want to hear. Then I will make them see, she countered. With pictures. The men who did this, they left a trail. You can follow it. I want to go with you. I want to photograph where they came from, who they work for. He was silent for a long time, his dark eyes studying her face, searching for the lies and broken promises he had come to expect. Why, he finally asked, why should I trust you? Because I need the truth as much as you do, she said, her voice ringing with a sincerity that surprised even herself. A lie is being used to steal from your people. It is also being used to blind mine. I will not be a party to it. She held his gaze, refusing to look away. I need you as my guide, and you need me to be your eyes for the white people, to show them the truth in a way they will understand. He considered her words, weighing them in the ancient scales of his experience. The setting sun caught the edges of his dark hair, framing his face in a halo of red-gold light. He was a man caught between two worlds, fighting to keep his own from being erased. She was a woman from one of those worlds, offering a weapon he did not understand but desperately needed. There will be danger, he said. I am aware. If you come, you follow my lead. No questions. Agreed, she said, on one condition. He raised a single questioning eyebrow. You make me a promise, and I will make you one. Abigail said, I promise that I will not bend the truth, not for my editor, not for Harlan Pike, not for anyone. I will report only what I see. He nodded slowly, accepting her terms. And your promise from me? Promise me, she said, her voice dropping, that you will not leave the one who walks with you behind. Nantan looked at her, at this strange, stubborn white woman with her hidden camera and her fierce belief in the power of a story. He gave a single, sharp nod. We do not abandon our own, he said, and in that simple statement, a pact was sealed, an uneasy alliance, born from violence and deception, but aimed at a single, distant point of truth. The journey began before the sun, in a world of gray shadow and cold air. Nantan moved with a silence that seemed to belong to the pre-dawn light, his horse placing its unshod hooves with careful precision. Abigail followed, with Maria riding beside her, a reassuring and occasionally humming presence. They did not follow the main trail, but instead cut across the land, weaving through canyons and arroyos that were invisible from the stagecoach road. Nantan was not following a path. He was reading a language written in broken twigs, displaced stones, and the faint impressions left in the hard, dry earth. Their destination was a place the Apache called the Place of Bitter Water, a spring that had gone dry 2 seasons past but was still a sacred site. As they crested a low rise, the smell of ash reached them, sharp and acrid on the morning air. The scene below was one of quiet devastation. A small, wickiup-like structure that had once sheltered the spring's opening was a skeleton of charred poles. The ground around it was blackened and scorched. It was an act of desecration, designed to wound the soul as much as the body. Abigail dismounted, her journal and pencil already in her hand. Nantan was already on his knees, his attention fixed on the ground near the burned structure. He said nothing, but pointed. Abigail came closer and saw what had captured his attention. In the soot and baked earth were deep ruts, 2 parallel lines that spoke of a heavy wagon. But it was the tracks alongside them that told the real story. They were the prints of the same iron-shod horses from the ambush. More damning still, pressed into the dirt, was the faint but unmistakable imprint of a steel wheel, its flange leaving a distinct mark unlike that of any ordinary wagon. It was the mark of a railroad cart. "Pike's supply wagons use these wheels to move equipment along the temporary tracks," Maria said, her voice tight with anger. "They brought their poison all the way out here." Abigail sketched the tracks with painstaking detail, her pencil strokes sharp and precise. She noted the depth of the impression, the unique flange mark, the pattern of the shod hooves. She wrote down the direction they had come from and the direction they had gone. This was not the work of raiding Apaches. This was a calculated act of industrial vandalism, staged to look like something else entirely. She was documenting the grammar of a lie. They rode on, deeper into the territory the Chiricahua called home. The land grew harsher, but also more beautiful. The red rock sculpted by wind and time into magnificent cathedrals of stone. Nantan's village was not what the lurid dime novels described. There were no crude huts or savage displays. It was a small, orderly encampment of wickiups, nestled in a hidden canyon where a thin trickle of water, their last reliable source, sustained a patch of green. The faces that watched their arrival were wary and proud, not hostile. They were the faces of a people enduring a slow siege. An older woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, emerged from the largest wickiup. Her eyes were dark and bright with an intelligence that seemed as ancient as the mountains. This was Naila, the community's healer and keeper of wisdom. Nantan spoke to her in their own tongue, his voice softer, more deferential than Abigail had yet heard. Naila's gaze fell upon Abigail, and it was not unkind. It was simply knowing. Inside a wickiup, a small boy lay on a soft deerskin, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. His mother knelt beside him, her expression a mask of fear. Naila immediately set to work, her hands moving with a practiced economy. She crushed dried leaves in a stone bowl, adding a splash of water to make a paste. She spoke to the child in a low, crooning voice, a sound like the wind moving through dry grass. Abigail recognized the signs of a lung fever. Her training in the war hospitals, rudimentary as it was, took over. She saw Naila preparing a poultice to draw out the heat, Maria translated. Abigail thought of the cool cloths and willow bark tea she had used for soldiers. "May I help?" Abigail asked, directing her question to Naila. "I have nursed men with this sickness." Naila looked at her, then at her clean, capable hands. She gave a slight nod. Abigail took a piece of clean linen from her satchel, dipped it in the precious cool water, and gently began to bathe the boy's forehead and wrists. She worked in concert with the old healer, a silent partnership of care. Naila applied the herbal poultice to the boy's chest, and Abigail continued to cool his skin. There was no white medicine or Apache medicine in that moment, only the shared, universal language of tending to the sick. The cultural divide that had seemed as wide as the territory itself shrank to the space of a small, feverish child. Later, as the boy's fever began to recede and his breathing eased, the three women sat outside in the fading light. Abigail was writing furiously in her journal, trying to capture every detail. Maria watched her, a small smile playing on her lips. "You write as fast as some men shoot, señorita." Abigail looked up, pausing for a moment. "I try to shoot with correct spelling," she replied, the small jest a welcome release of the day's tension. The next day, Nantan sought her out. He led her away from the village, to a place where the trail of the raiders was still clear in the sand of a dry wash. "You write things in your book," he said, "but you do not see." He knelt and gestured for her to join him. "This track," he said, pointing to a hoof print. "See how the horse favors its left foreleg? The print is deeper here. The rider is a heavy man who leans forward when he rides." He moved to another set of tracks. "This one is different. A lighter man. A nervous horse. It dances. It does not walk a straight line." He taught her to see the stories the land told, to read the narrative of speed and weight and intention left by those who passed over it. Abigail, in turn, felt compelled to show him her own tool. She took out the small dry plate camera from her boot. "This is how I will show your truth to my people," she explained. She opened the back, showing him the prepared glass plate. "Light comes through here," she said, pointing to the lens, "and it paints a picture on the glass." He looked at the small, intricate machine with a deep curiosity. He reached out a hand, his fingers hesitating just above the shutter mechanism. "It captures a shadow. It captures a moment of light, a moment of truth," she said. She showed him how to hold it, how to look through the viewfinder, as she adjusted his grip. Her fingers brushed against the back of his hand. His skin was warm, the touch unexpectedly gentle. A current passed between them, brief and silent, a flicker of warmth in the vast, impersonal landscape. It was a connection that had nothing to do with their purpose, and yet everything to do with it. That connection was shattered by what he showed her next. He led her to a high ridge overlooking a wide, flat plain dotted with small mounds of stone. It was a peaceful, sacred place, and cutting right through the middle of it was a raw, ugly scar in the earth, marked by newly driven wooden stakes, connected by a single strand of wire. "A survey line," Abigail breathed, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "Our ancestors are buried here," Nantan said, his voice devoid of emotion, which made his words all the more powerful. "This is Pike's railroad. He drives his steel through the bones of our grandmothers." The fence was more than a line on a map. It was a declaration of war, a statement that nothing, not even the dead, was sacred in the face of progress. Abigail felt a cold fury. This was the story she had to tell. The confirmation of their fears came 2 days later. Maria had ridden into Mesquite Crossing to gather supplies and news. She returned after dark, her face grim. She had arranged a secret meeting with Sheriff Vale, who, it seemed, had a sliver of conscience fighting for survival. "It is worse than we thought," Maria told them, her voice low. "The sheriff says Pike's lawyers in Washington have a file, a list of every argument, every horse theft, every supposed raid for the last 5 years, all blamed on the Chiricahua. Vale says most of it is lies, things Pike's own men have done, but it is a record, a file of violence. They are using it to push for a federal order to have you all removed. He says the judge could sign it any day." The news fell like a stone into the quiet of the canyon. A legal document, built on a foundation of lies, would give Pike everything he wanted. It would make the theft of their land the law. The final blow came in the form of a letter for Abigail, which Maria had picked up from Sam Ashby. It was from her editor in Philadelphia. His words were a splash of cold, cynical water. He was not interested in shod horse tracks or desecrated graves. "Abigail," the letter read, "the Telegraph brings news of an Apache attack on the stagecoach. This is the story our readers crave, the drama of the frontier, the thin line of civilization holding back the savage tide. We need a headline that grabs them. Savages threaten railroad's path of progress. Send me that story. Send me the fear and the danger. That is what sells newspapers." Abigail read the letter twice, then slowly crumpled it in her fist. The pressure from the east was as relentless as the pressure from the west. She was caught in the middle, a tiny point of resistance against two overwhelming forces. That night, by the light of their small fire, she smoothed out the page and wrote her reply on the back. "I will not write your lies for you," she wrote, her pencil digging into the paper. "I will send you the truth, backed by photographs and sworn testimony. If you will not print it, I will find someone who will. The only savage tide I see here is one of greed, and it wears a suit and signs contracts, not buckskin." The weight of their task settled upon them. It was not just about exposing a single lie anymore. It was a race against a legal machine greased by money and prejudice. Later that night, Abigail saw Nantan standing alone by the canyon's small spring, the source of life for his people. He stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, a solitary guardian. She could not hear him speak, but she saw the set of his shoulders, the tension in his frame. He was making a vow, not to a distant god, but to the water, the land, and the spirits of the ancestors sleeping beneath Pike's cruel wire fence. He would protect this place, or he would die with it. The conflict was no longer just about land. It was about existence, and it was drawing them all toward a confrontation they could not avoid. Harlan Pike returned to Mesquite Crossing not with the subtlety of a fox, but with the grandiosity of a Roman emperor. He rolled into town in a polished carriage, bringing with him a wagon loaded with sacks of flour and barrels of cheap whiskey. He was not a man who dealt in threats when bribes were so much more effective. He set up in the dusty plaza in front of the saloon, a benevolent smile fixed on his face, handing out his largesse to the townspeople. He spoke of prosperity, of the great future the railroad would bring, of the civilizing influence of commerce. He was buying their loyalty with bread and liquor, and the people, worn down by drought and hardship, were eager to be bought. While Pike played the part of the town's savior, a different kind of man slipped into town unnoticed. His name was Kane. He was a quiet man with pale, watchful eyes and a stillness that was more menacing than any loud threat. He did not drink Pike's whiskey or eat his flour. He simply observed, his gaze lingering on the boarding house where Abigail Bennett stayed, on the stable where Maria Ortiz kept her horse, and on the distant mesas where Nantan watched over his people. Pike had hired him not to make noise, but to create silence. The poison of Pike's public generosity and private whispers seeped into the town's soul. On Sunday, Abigail attended the small church service, hoping to find a moment of peace, a reminder of the community she had once thought all towns possessed. She found none. The sermon was about serpents in the garden, about the dangers of temptation and the insidious nature of those who would turn away from their own kind. The words were aimed at her as surely as if the preacher had spoken her name. After the service, as the congregants gathered outside in the thin shade, the whispers followed her. "That is the one, the newspaper woman? Spends her time out in the hills with the savages. They say she prefers their company. It is unnatural." Abigail felt the stares like a physical weight. These were the same people who had smiled and taken Pike's flour. Maria, who had come with her for reasons Abigail suspected were more about protection than piety, stood by her side, her back straight, when one of the more self-righteous women, the wife of the general store owner, looked Abigail up and down with open contempt. Maria's patience finally snapped. "Is there something we can help you with?" Senora Maria asked, her voice dangerously sweet. "We are just concerned for your soul." "Miss," the woman sniffed, "to be seen consorting with those godless heathens." Maria's smile was all teeth. "That is funny," she said, her voice carrying so that several others could hear. "The heathen I know pulled a child from a fever, and the savage I ride with saved this town's stagecoach passengers. I wonder, what have all your good Christian gentlemen done for anyone lately, besides get loud at the saloon?" The woman flushed and turned away, but the sentiment remained. a thick, suffocating cloud of prejudice. The trap for Nantan was sprung 3 days later. He and Maria had ridden into town for supplies. As they were tying their horses, one of Pike's foremen, a large, belligerent man named Brody, stumbled out of the saloon. He bumped into Maria, sending a small sack of beans spilling into the dust. "Watch where you are going," he snarled, his words slurred. "You are the one who is walking like a blind calf," Maria retorted, bending to gather her things. Brody kicked the sack, scattering the beans further. "I do not like your tone." Nantan stepped between them. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply placed himself in Brody's path, a silent, immovable object. "The trouble is not with her," Nantan said, his voice low and even. "Oh, the redskin wants to talk," Brody sneered, puffing out his chest. Several of his friends were now drifting out of the saloon, positioning themselves. It was all too perfect, too staged. "What are you going to do about it?" Nantan did not move. He just watched Brody, his eyes holding that familiar, burning calm. The foreman, fueled by cheap whiskey and a sense of his own importance, shoved Nantan hard in the chest. It was the excuse they needed. Nantan absorbed the blow without giving ground, but the act was done. Sheriff Vale appeared as if on cue. "That is enough, I saw that. Assaulting a citizen. Nantan, you are under arrest for disturbing the peace." Nantan did not resist as Vale took his arm. He looked over at Abigail, who had witnessed the entire scene from the doorway of the boarding house. His eyes conveyed a single, clear message. This is the game. This is how they play. Abigail spent the next few hours in a fury of purpose. She had a piece of the puzzle, a photograph she had taken 2 days before. Under the pretense of documenting the railroad supply chain, she had gone to Pike's main warehouse on the edge of town. While photographing the stacks of rails and barrels, she had carefully, secretly, taken a picture of the ground beside a heavy equipment cart. The photograph, developed in the cramped, makeshift dark room of her boarding house room, clearly showed the unique, flanged wheel print in the dirt, identical to the one she had sketched at the burned Apache spring. She found Sheriff Vale in his office, staring at the paperwork on his desk as if it were a coiled snake. "You know that was a setup." "Sheriff," she said, placing the glass plate negative on his desk alongside a freshly made print. Brody was looking for a fight. "I have 4 witnesses who say Nantan started it," Vale said, not looking at her. "You have 4 of Pike's men who say what they are paid to say," she countered. She pushed the photograph toward him. "Look at this. This is a print of a flanged wheel from a railroad cart. I took this picture at Pike's warehouse yesterday. And this," she said, opening her journal and pointing to her detailed sketch, "is the track left by the wagon that burned the Apache spring. They are the same." Vale looked from the photo to the sketch, and for the first time, a genuine crack appeared in his weary facade. He could deny a man's word, he could ignore a woman's testimony. But a photograph was a different kind of witness. It was a captured piece of light, a silent, irrefutable truth. He was a man caught between Pike's money and a fact he could hold in his hand. He said nothing, but he picked up the photograph and stared at it for a long, long time. That night, Abigail returned to the jailhouse. She had spent the afternoon reading the territorial statutes she had purchased from a traveling lawyer weeks ago. She was the daughter of a blacksmith. She understood how things were put together, and how they could be taken apart. "You have to release him. Sheriff," she said. Vale looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "On what grounds?" Territorial Code, Section 4, Paragraph 3. A man can be held for 24 hours on a charge of disturbing the peace. After that, a formal, written complaint must be filed by the aggrieved party. "Has Mr. Brody filed a complaint?" Vale's silence was his answer. Brody had done his job. Filing paperwork was not part of it. "If no complaint is filed, the prisoner must be released." Abigail pressed on. "It has been 26 hours. You are holding him illegally." The sheriff looked at the bars of the cell, then at the photograph still sitting on his desk. He was a man being crushed between 2 stones. with a deep sigh of resignation. He took the keys from the hook on the wall. "You have made my life very difficult, Miss Bennett." "The truth is often difficult." "Sheriff," she replied. Nantan was waiting outside. The brief scuffle with Brody had left a deep, raw scrape on the back of his right hand, in the quiet of her room at the boarding house. Abigail cleaned the wound. She worked with the same gentle efficiency she had shown with the sick child. The room was silent save for the hiss of the lamp and the soft sound of the cloth on his skin. He watched her, his expression unreadable. She could feel his gaze on her as she worked, and the air grew thick with unspoken things. She wrapped a clean linen bandage around his hand, her fingers light and precise. He flinched slightly as she tightened the knot. "If you frown like that," she murmured, not looking up from her work, "I will stitch it crooked." A small, almost imperceptible sound escaped his lips. It might have been a laugh. "There are no stitches. It is a figure of speech," she said, finally meeting his eyes. The space between them was suddenly very small. "I am glad you are out." "Your paper words are strong," he said, looking at his bandaged hand. "Sometimes they are the only weapons we have." Before he left, slipping away into the night as silently as he had come, he stopped at the door. "Naila says the truth for your people is like water trying to flow over stone. It moves, but it is very slow. It takes a long time to wear a new path." The healer's words stayed with her, and they guided what she did next. She knew she needed more than just tracks in the dirt. She needed to show what Pike's Railroad was truly destroying. With information from Naila, relayed through Maria, she found what she was looking for. It was not a paper map, but a large, supple piece of deer skin, kept hidden in the old woman's wiki-up. On it were drawn the landmarks of the Apache territory. Not with ink, but with charcoal and dyes made from berries and clay. It showed the springs, the hunting grounds, and, most importantly, a series of small, circular markings that corresponded to the stone burial mounds on the plains. It was a sacred map, a testament of generations. When Abigail laid it out and compared it to the railroad survey maps she had acquired, the lines matched with chilling precision. Pike's line of steel did not just cross their land, it targeted the heart of their history, aiming to obliterate their very memory from the earth. The symbolism was as stark and brutal as a killing blow steel in greed against stone and ancestors. The next afternoon, she and Nantan rode out to the survey line to photograph the desecration, using the deerskin map as their guide, as Abigail set up her small camera, trying to frame a shot that showed both the surveyor's stake and one of the ancient stone mounds. The air split with a deafening crack. A chip of rock exploded from the burial mound, inches from Nantan's head. They both dropped to the ground, taking cover behind the stones. There was no second shot. Just an echoing silence. After a few tense minutes, Nantan crept to the top of the ridge. He saw nothing but the shimmering heat and the empty land. It was a warning, a message. As they made their way back, Nantan's keen eyes spotted something glinting in the dust where a sniper might have laid. He picked it up. It was not a standard Army-issue cartridge. The brass was heavier, the lead bullet oddly shaped. It was the work of a man who made his own ammunition, a specialist, Kane. He had announced his presence. The game was no longer about public opinion or legal maneuvers. It had escalated to a far more personal and deadly level. They were no longer just being watched. They were being hunted. Kane's warning shot had changed the nature of their work. They were no longer investigators. They were targets. The slow, methodical gathering of evidence was a luxury they could no longer afford. The forged treaty that Sheriff Vale had mentioned, the legal document Pike was using as the foundation for his claim, was the heart of the matter. They had to find it. The plan was born of desperation and Maria's intimate knowledge of Mesquite Crossing's sleepy routines. Pike's records were kept not in a vault, but in a small office at the back of the railroad's main warehouse, managed by a clerk who spent every afternoon from 2 o'clock until 4 o'clock at the saloon, playing cards. "He is a man of habit," Maria had said, a glint in her eye, "and his habit is our opportunity." They moved in the suffocating heat of the afternoon, when the town was in a stupor. Abigail and Maria slipped through a back alley, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust. The warehouse smelled of oil, raw lumber, and steel. The lock on the office door was new and sturdy, but the window frame was warped from the sun. Maria worked a thin knife into the gap, her movements deft and practiced. With a soft click, the latch gave way. Inside, the office was an island of meticulous order in the surrounding chaos of the warehouse. Ledgers were stacked in neat piles. Maps were rolled and stored in wooden tubes. A large, ornate filing cabinet of dark wood stood against the far wall. It had to be there. While Maria stood watch at the window, Abigail went to work. The cabinet was locked. She studied it for a moment, her blacksmith father's daughter recognizing the simple pin tumbler mechanism. Using a hairpin from her satchel and a small metal file, she began to probe the lock, her ears straining for the telltale click of the pins. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the large wall clock a hammer blow against her nerves. Finally, she felt the last pin give way and the drawer slid open with a low groan. The files were organized with chilling efficiency land surveys, payrolls, shipping manifests, under the heading Native Land Acquisitions. She found it. It was a thick document, bound in leather, bearing the official seal of the United States territorial government. The text was dense legal language, granting Pike's railroad title to a wide swath of land in exchange for a one-time payment and a promise of protected territory further south. And then she saw the signatures. At the bottom of the last page were a series of crude X's, each marked as belonging to a different Chiricahua chief. Beside them was a large embossed seal, an eagle clutching arrows, meant to look official. But something was wrong. Abigail, whose eyes were trained to see the subtle differences in chemical reactions on a photographic plate, noticed it immediately. The ink of the government seal at the top of the page was a faded black, having soaked into the fibers of the paper evenly. The ink of the seal beside the forged signatures was a harsher black. It had bled at the edges, and the impression was deeper, sharper. It had been applied recently, with a different press. It was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that. "Maria, look," she whispered, her voice trembling with the thrill of discovery. As Maria leaned in to look, a shadow fell across the doorway. They both froze. Kane stood there, his pale eyes devoid of any emotion. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw his gun. He simply looked at them, and in his gaze, they saw their own deaths. "Mr. Pike does not appreciate people reading his private correspondence," he said, his voice a soft, dry rasp. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Maria reacted, shoving a stack of ledgers off the desk. They crashed to the floor, and in that moment of distraction, she grabbed Abigail's arm and pulled her toward the open window. "Go!" she yelled. They scrambled out the window and ran. Not toward the town, but away from it, toward the broken, hostile land of cactus and rock. They could hear Kane behind them, his footsteps steady and unhurried. He was not chasing them, he was herding them. The cactus patch was a nightmare of thorns. Spines tore at their skirts and blouses, ripping long, bleeding scratches in their skin. Every step was a fresh agony. Abigail could hear Kane's footsteps getting closer. He was toying with them, enjoying their panic. Suddenly, a horse and rider appeared on the ridge to their left. It was Nantan. He must have been watching, waiting. He urged his horse down the slope, moving with impossible speed and grace through the treacherous terrain. Kane saw him and finally drew his pistol, turning to fire. But Nantan was faster. A single arrow flew from his bow, a dark streak against the pale sky. It did not strike Kane, but his horse. The animal screamed and went down. Its leg pierced through. Kane was thrown hard, landing in a heap in the dust, his pistol skittering out of his reach. Nantan was on him in an instant, a knife in his hand. He stood over the winded gunman, the point of the blade at his throat. Kane looked up, his pale eyes for once showing a flicker of fear. This was it, the moment of frontier justice, swift and final. But Nantan did not move. He held the blade there for a long, silent moment, his face a mask of cold fury. Abigail held her breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered the knife. He had looked into the abyss of vengeance and chosen to step back. He would not become the man Pike accused him of being. He kicked Kane's pistol further away into the cactus, then turned his back on the man and walked to where Abigail and Maria were catching their breath. He had not killed Kane, but he had defeated him, stripping him of his power and leaving him afoot and unarmed in the wilderness. It was a choice for justice, not for blood. As they stood there, the world seemed to shift. The relentless sun, which had been beating down on them all day, disappeared behind a sudden, bruised-looking bank of clouds that had gathered unnoticed on the horizon. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange energy. A low rumble echoed from the mountains. "We must go," Nantan said, his eyes scanning the sky. "Now!" The first drops of rain were fat and cold, hitting the baked earth with a sizzle. Within minutes, the drops became a torrent, a solid, blinding sheet of water that turned the dust to mud. The rare, violent summer storm had broken. The dry wash they were standing near, a place that had not seen water in years, began to whisper, then to hiss. They were scrambling up the side of the arroyo when the whisper became a roar, a solid wall of brown, churning water, thick with mud and debris, came rushing down the canyon. The flash flood was upon them. A section of the bank beneath Abigail's feet gave way, and she slid down into the rising torrent. The shock of the cold water stole her breath. She was pulled under, tumbled head over heels in the powerful current. She fought her way to the surface, gasping for air, only to be slammed against a submerged rock. The world was a maelstrom of roaring water and pain. She saw Nantan on the bank, a look of desperation on his face. Then the current caught her again, pulling her away. He did not hesitate. He plunged into the raging floodwater, swimming with powerful, desperate strokes. The current was a living thing, fighting him, trying to tear them apart. He reached her just as her strength was failing. He wrapped one powerful arm around her waist, holding her head above the water. She clung to him, her terror absolute. "Hold on," he yelled over the roar of the flood. He was aiming for a thicket of tamarisk bushes that clung stubbornly to the canyon wall, their deep roots the only thing holding them against the flood's fury. The water tore at them, pulling them downstream, but he fought it with every ounce of his strength. They reached the bushes, and he thrust her into the thick, whipping branches, shielding her body with his own as a log swept past, its splintered end missing her head by inches. They clung there together, tangled in the branches, while the world tore itself apart around them. The water was a physical force, pressing them together, stealing their warmth. Abigail could feel the hard, lean strength of Nantan's body against hers, the frantic beat of his heart against her back. It was not a tender embrace. It was a desperate, primal act of survival. In that moment, stripped of everything but the will to live, there was no white woman, no Apache warrior. There were only two people, holding on against a force that was trying to kill them both. When the peak of the flood had passed and the water level began to drop, he half carried, half dragged her from the water onto a muddy spit of land. They collapsed, shivering and exhausted, in the thin shelter of the tamarisk. The rain softened to a steady drizzle. The world was quiet again, save for the gurgle of the retreating water and the sound of their own ragged breaths. Abigail began to tremble, a delayed reaction of cold and shock. Nantan stripped off his wet leather vest and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was not much, but it was something. They sat in silence for a long time, the shared trauma a bond stronger than any words. "I was so afraid," Abigail finally whispered, her voice hoarse. It was not just the fear of drowning she was talking about. The events of the day, the forged document, the chase, the flood, had brought all her anxieties to the surface. All this time, I have been chasing this story. So sure of myself, so sure of the power of the truth. She looked at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable in the gray light. Now, I am afraid that if I publish the wrong words, if I tell this story the wrong way, it will not save your people. It will destroy them. It will be the final legal excuse to wipe them away for good. Her confession hung in the damp air between them, raw and honest. He did not offer easy reassurances. He simply listened, his dark eyes fixed on her face. Then, he gave her a piece of his own truth, a story he had likely never told another white person. "When I was a scout for the army," he began, his voice low, "I led them through lands I knew. I showed them the hidden springs and the safe passages. I did this to keep the soldiers away from our villages, to prevent a war I knew we could not win. I thought I was protecting my people." He paused, his gaze turning inward, to a place of old pain. "But some of our warriors saw me as a traitor. They said I walked the white man's path, that I helped them take our land. There are still those in my own village who will not speak my name. I carry the weight of that choice every day, the guilt of trying to save my people by using the weapons of my enemies." Abigail looked at him, seeing for the first time the true depth of his internal conflict. They were both trapped, in their own ways, between two worlds, burdened by the fear that their actions, however well-intentioned, might bring about the very destruction they were trying to prevent. A new, deeper understanding passed between them, an empathy born of shared vulnerability. The flood had washed away their defenses, leaving only the truth of their fears. As they made their way back to the hidden canyon under a sky scrubbed clean by the storm, their purpose had crystallized. It was no longer enough to just know the truth. They had to force the world to see it. "The traveling federal commissioner," Abigail said, her mind already working. "Sheriff Vale said he was due in the territory. He holds hearings on land disputes." "He will be in Mesquite Crossing in 5 days," Nantan said. "He will listen to Pike. He will not listen to an Apache." "He will listen to me," Abigail said, a new resolve in her voice. "And he will look at my evidence, the photograph of the wheel print, the deerskin map, the forged treaty. We will present it all at a public hearing." The stakes were now impossibly high. If they succeeded, they might save his people. If they failed, Pike would have everything he wanted, legally sanctioned and unstoppable. Vale would be ruined. Abigail's career would be over, and the Chiricahua would be ghosts on their own land. When they finally reached the camp, drenched and muddy and bone-tired, Maria met them at the edge of the canyon. She took one look at their faces, at their torn clothes and their shared, grim expression, and seemed to understand everything. She said nothing about their ordeal. Instead, she held out a piece of warm cornbread to each of them. "Eat," she said, her voice full of a practicality that was its own form of comfort. "We fight better on a full stomach." The 4 days leading up to the federal commissioner's hearing were a strange mixture of tense preparation and profound quiet. In the hidden canyon, Abigail worked alongside the Chiricahua women, grinding corn and mending clothes, becoming a familiar, if still strange, presence. She shared her small supply of coffee, a gesture of goodwill that was accepted with silent nods of appreciation. Nantan spent the time scouting, his presence a constant, watchful perimeter around the encampment, ensuring Kane did not return to finish his work. Abigail had organized her evidence with the precision of a field surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The damning photograph of the flanged wheel print, the detailed sketch from the burned spring, and the deerskin map were all wrapped in oilcloth and tucked securely in her satchel. The story of the forged treaty, with its mismatched ink, was etched in her memory, ready to be recounted. They had done all they could. Now, they could only wait for the dawn and the ride into Mesquite Crossing, where their small collection of truths would be weighed against Harlan Pike's mountain of wealth and influence. The night before the hearing was still and breathless. A sliver of moon hung in the vast, star-dusted sky, offering little light, A quiet anxiety settled over the village. It was not the loud fear of an imminent attack, but the deep, gnawing worry of a people whose fate was about to be decided by a foreign power in a foreign language. Children were hushed, and the elders sat by their small fires, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, their thoughts turned inward. Abigail sat with Nantan and Maria near the edge of the camp, the warmth of a small, carefully tended fire pushing back the desert's nightly chill. They spoke little. The silence between them filled not with awkwardness, but with the comfortable understanding of people who had faced death together. The attack came with no warning cry, no thundering of hooves. It began with a smell, the sharp, greasy scent of kerosene, followed by the hungry crackle of a fire catching on dry wood and thatch. A sudden, malevolent orange glow painted the canyon walls, and a wave of heat rolled through the encampment. Panic erupted. It was not a battle. It was an act of pure, vicious destruction. Cain and his men, moving under the cover of darkness, had targeted their winter food store, a large wickiup where the dried meat, corn, and beans were kept. It was a blow aimed at their survival, a promise of starvation if they somehow managed to keep their land. Nantan was on his feet in an instant, not reaching for a weapon, but for a water bucket. The people, he shouted, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. "Get the children and elders away from the flames." Abigail reacted without thinking, her hospital training overriding any sense of personal danger. She ran toward the nearest wickiup, helping a frightened mother guide her two small children out into the relative safety of the open canyon. The air was thick with choking, black smoke that seared the lungs and blinded the eyes. Flames licked up the sides of the storage hut, a roaring bonfire that threatened to spread to the nearby family dwellings. The entire village mobilized, a desperate bucket brigade forming a line from the precious, slow-trickling spring. Men, women, and even the older children worked with a silent, frantic efficiency, their faces grim in the hellish light. Nantan was a whirlwind of controlled energy, directing the effort, his voice calm and authoritative amidst the panic, pulling a section of burning thatch away from a nearby wickiup with his bare hands. Abigail joined the line, her hands raw from the rough bucket handle, her lungs aching. She worked alongside Maria, their movements synchronized, a small, determined point of resistance against the consuming flames. They were not just trying to save food, they were trying to save the fragile flame of hope that had sustained them through these past weeks. She was helping to move the last of the salvageable sacks of corn, dragging them away from the intense heat, when her foot slipped on a patch of ground made slick by spilled water. She stumbled backward, her arms pinwheeling for balance, her momentum carrying her toward a wide bed of glowing red embers that had cascaded from the collapsing wall of the storage hut. A gasp escaped her lips as she saw the shimmering heat rising to meet her. Time seemed to slow. She saw the individual coals, pulsing with a malevolent light. She felt the searing heat on the back of her legs. And then he was there. Nantan moved with a speed that seemed to defy the smoke-filled darkness. He caught her in a single, fluid motion, one arm wrapping around her waist, the other under her knees. He lifted her clear of the ground, his body a shield between her and the fire. Her skirt rose as an Apache lifted her, their breath tangled in wild, gentle need. For a single, suspended moment, the roar of the fire and the shouts of the villagers faded into a distant murmur. There was only the solid strength of his arms around her, the smell of wood smoke and sweat, and the startling proximity of his face. His dark eyes, reflecting the firelight, were fixed on hers. She could feel the desperate pounding of his heart. Or perhaps it was her own. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern rim of the canyon, a soft gray promise that seemed a world away from the destruction around them. The moment was not one of passion, but of something far deeper, a profound and instinctual recognition, a shared spark of life in the face of imminent harm. He set her down gently, a few safe feet from the embers, his hands lingering on her arms for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. as if to assure himself that she was real, that she was unharmed. The spell was broken. The roar of the fire rushed back in, and they were once again two people fighting to save a village. They worked until the sun was fully risen, and the fire was a sullen, smoking ruin. The food store was gone. More than half of their winter supplies had been turned to ash. The villagers stood in stunned, exhausted silence, their faces smudged with soot, their expressions a mixture of grief and weary defiance. Nantan led Abigail away from the others, to a small, quiet alcove in the rocks where a seep of water kept a patch of moss alive. They sat on a smooth, cool stone, the adrenaline of the night leaving them hollow and drained. "This was Cain," Abigail said, her voice a raw whisper. "It was his answer to us, to the hearing." It was Pike's answer. Nantan corrected her, his voice grim. "He is telling us that even if we win with words, he can still make us starve." Abigail looked at her hands, still trembling slightly. The fear she had felt when she slipped was gone, replaced by a different, colder dread. "When I stand up in that town hall tomorrow," she said, looking not at him, but at the canyon wall, "they will all look at me. The good people from the church, Sam Ashby, the sheriff. They will see me standing with you, speaking for you, and they will call me a traitor to my own kind. They will say I have turned my back on my own people for a savage." The word felt like acid in her mouth. Nantan was silent for a long time, watching a lizard scurry across a sun-warmed rock. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of his own past. "When I stood with the soldiers, I told myself I was protecting my people, but I watched them map our lands. I listened to them talk of our removal. My own people look at me now, standing with you, using your words and your photograph box as weapons. They whisper that Nantan has forgotten the ways of the Apache, that he has put his trust in a white woman who will leave when her story is written." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes holding a deep, shared vulnerability. "We both walk a path that makes us traitors in someone's eyes." In that moment of shared confession, the last barriers between them seemed to dissolve. They were not defined by the color of their skin or the language they spoke, but by the difficult choices they had made and the fears they carried. "Then we must make a promise," Abigail said, her voice gaining a sliver of its usual strength. "To each other." He waited, his gaze steady on hers. "After the hearing tomorrow," she continued, "no matter what the commissioner decides, no matter what happens, we will choose a path that does not harm the innocent. We are seeking justice, not revenge. We will not become like them." He considered her words, then gave a slow, solemn nod. It was a vow made in the ashes of his people's hope, a reassertion of their shared moral compass in a world that seemed to have lost its own. Abigail became aware of a sharp, stinging sensation on her left wrist. She looked down and saw a small, angry red patch where a flying spark had landed. It was a minor injury, a triviality in the face of the night's devastation, but it was a focal point for the pain and exhaustion she felt. Nantan saw it too. Without a word, he untied the dark kerchief from his neck. It was the same one he always wore, a simple strip of cloth that had become as much a part of him as his silence. He dipped it into the small pool of water collected at the base of the mossy rock. The cool liquid, a startling luxury. He wrung it out gently, and then, with an unexpected tenderness, wrapped the damp cloth around her wrist. The cool moisture soothed the burn instantly. His fingers were deft and careful, his touch sending a quiet shiver through her. She looked from her bandaged wrist to his face. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "You have a habit of saving me," she said, her voice soft. "First me, then my camera. I suppose I should be grateful you have your priorities in order." The faintest hint of a smile touched his own mouth, a rare and fleeting thing. He said nothing, but his eyes held a warmth that went beyond the rising heat of the sun. The gesture of the kerchief, his promise of protection, was no longer a symbol. It was a reality, a cool, gentle weight upon her skin. They sat in a companionable silence as the canyon came slowly back to life. The sounds of a waking world returned: the cry of a hawk circling high above, the buzz of insects in a patch of wild sage, the murmur of voices as the villagers began the grim task of sifting through the ruins, the desperate chase, the terrifying flood, the violent fire. All of it had led them to this quiet moment of shared understanding. The feelings that had taken root between them were not a distraction from their purpose. They were the very heart of it. It was the reason to fight, the reason to seek justice, the reason to face the coming day not as allies, but as partners. Their courage and their resolve forged anew in the fire. The church and mesquite crossing served a dual purpose, its pews cleared to the sides to make room for a long trestle table and a collection of mismatched chairs. It was a house of God on Sundays and a house of men's law on weekdays. Today, it felt like neither. The air was thick and heavy, not with piety or justice, but with the fine, choking dust of suspicion. Every bench was filled. The townspeople, their faces a mixture of curiosity and hostility, had turned out in force to witness the confrontation between the railroad titan and the Eastern newspaper woman who had taken up with the Apache. As Abigail walked to the front of the room, flanked by Maria and Nantan, a wave of whispers followed her, a sibilant, ugly sound like snakes slithering through dry leaves. There she is. Look at her, walking in with him like she's got no shame, sleeping with a savage. They say. The words were meant to sting, to unnerve her, and they did. Each syllable was a small stone thrown from the crowd. She felt the weight of their collective judgment, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. She clutched the satchel containing her evidence, the smooth leather a small, solid anchor in a sea of animosity. At the front table sat Federal Commissioner Thompson, a man whose face was a mask of bureaucratic neutrality, though his tired eyes suggested he had seen and heard every form of human greed and desperation the territories had to offer. Beside him, Harlan Pike sat looking perfectly at ease, dressed in a fine wool suit that seemed to repel the dust and heat. He had a lawyer by his side, a man with a sharp, predatory face who looked at Abigail as if she were a particularly interesting insect to be dissected. The hearing began, and Pike's lawyer spoke first. He painted a grand picture of progress, of a railroad that was a mighty artery of commerce and civilization, bringing prosperity to a wild land. He spoke of the constant threat posed by the native tribes, portraying them as obstacles to destiny, a violent and unpredictable element that needed to be contained for the good of all. He presented Pike's forged treaty and the meticulously fabricated file of grievances as incontrovertible proof. It was a masterful performance, a narrative so clean and compelling that Abigail felt a flicker of despair. How could her small, complicated truths compete with such a grand and simple lie? When it was her turn to speak, she walked to the makeshift lectern, a wooden crate set upon a small table. The room was silent, but it was a hostile silence. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging her, dismissing her before she had even opened her mouth. Before she could speak, however, a chair scraped against the floorboards. Sheriff Enoch Vale stood up. He did not look at Pike, nor at the commissioner. He looked out at the faces of the townspeople, the men and women he had served for 10 years. "Before Miss Bennett speaks," he said, his voice rough but clear, "there is something I have to say." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not on the agenda for a long time. He continued, "I have taken the easy path. I have looked the other way when I should have looked closer. I have accepted explanations that I knew, deep down, were not the truth." He finally turned his gaze to the commissioner. "Sir, I have official reports of numerous incidents over the past 2 years, raids and thefts, all attributed to the Chiricahua. I now believe, and I have evidence to support, that a significant number of these incidents, including the recent attack on the stagecoach, were not carried out by the Apache at all. They were staged by white men, paid to look like Indians, in order to create a false record of aggression." A stunned silence fell over the room. Harlan Pike's benevolent smile did not falter. but a muscle twitched in his jaw. The sheriff had just set a fire to his own career, and to Pike's carefully constructed case. "I was a coward," Vale finished, his voice dropping. "I let myself be persuaded that what was good for the railroad was good for this town. I was wrong." He sat down, the sound of his chair on the floorboards echoing in the silent room. Abigail took a deep breath, her own courage bolstered by the sheriff's unexpected act of integrity. This was her chance. She began not with accusations, but with facts. She laid the glass plate negative of the flanged wheel print on the commissioner's table, along with the print she had made. This photograph was taken at the railroad's main supply warehouse, she stated, her voice steady. "The tracks you see are from a heavy equipment cart." Then, she opened her journal and placed her sketch beside it. "And this drawing is of the tracks left at a sacred Apache site that was burned to the ground. As you can see, the tracks are identical." Next, she unrolled the deerskin map. Its soft, worn surface, a stark contrast to the crisp legal documents Pike had presented. "This is a map of the Chiricahua lands, showing their ancestral burial grounds." She then overlaid it with Pike's survey map. "The railroad's proposed route does not simply cross this land. It runs directly through this sacred cemetery, an act of desecration designed to break the spirit of a people." She placed the specially made bullet on the table. "This was recovered from the site of that cemetery, after a sniper fired upon us. It is a custom round, not army issue." Finally, she addressed the treaty itself. She pointed to the seal beside the forged signatures. "As a photographer, I work with chemicals and paper. I know what a 2-year-old ink application looks like after it is soaked into the fibers of the paper. And I know what a fresh application looks like. This seal, gentlemen, is fresh. It was applied with a different press and with different ink from the official seal at the top of the document. This treaty is a forgery." Pike's lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection, this is baseless speculation from an amateur with no credentials. This woman is a journalist, a purveyor of fiction and sensationalism." Harlan Pike himself now stood, his benevolent mask replaced by a look of cold fury. "Commissioner, this is nothing more than a personal vendetta. This woman arrived in our town and immediately fell under the influence of a known Apache renegade." He gestured toward Nantan, his voice dripping with insinuation. "She has been seen consorting with him at all hours, living in his camp. Her judgment is clearly compromised by a personal, and I might say, inappropriate, relationship. This is not a matter of public interest. It is a case of slander, driven by a woman's misplaced affections for a savage." The ugly whispers in the room erupted into open murmurs. Abigail felt her face flush with heat. He was twisting her purpose, her very identity, into something cheap and sordid. Before she could respond, Nantan stepped forward. He did not go to the lectern. He simply stood in the open space, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority that no amount of shouting could diminish. He did not look at Pike or the commissioner. He spoke to the people of the town. "My name is Nantan," he said, his voice calm and clear. "The men who work for Mr. Pike speak of progress. They speak of steel and money. I will speak of the earth." He gestured toward the window, toward the distant, shimmering mesas. "That land you call empty holds the lullabies my mother sang to me. Her bones are buried there. The steel of a railroad can pass quietly, or it can pass with the screams of ghosts. It can pass with truth, or it can pass with lies. You choose which sound you wish to live with." He said nothing more. He did not need to. His few simple words had cut through all the legal jargon and personal attacks, leaving behind a single, profound truth. As Nantan stepped back, another figure moved forward from the small Apache delegation that had come with them. It was Naila. The old woman walked with a slow, deliberate grace to the commissioner's table. She did not speak. She simply opened her hand and placed a small, simple brass ring on the polished wood. It was dented and worn with age. "This was my husband's," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "He wore it on the day he signed a peace treaty with your General Howard. He kept his word." We have paid our tax in blood for peace. We ask now only for the tax of truth." She turned and walked back to her seat, leaving the small ring on the table, an object so humble and yet so heavy with history that it seemed to make all of Pike's grand documents look like meaningless paper. The room was held in a stunned, emotional silence, but the final twist was yet to come. Sheriff Vale stood up again, a pair of handcuffs dangling from his hand. "Commissioner," he said, "based on the evidence presented by Miss Bennett and my own investigation, I took the liberty of arresting a man this morning, a hired gun by the name of Kane." Pike's face went pale. He was found in possession of a custom rifle and ammunition that matches the slug Miss Bennett presented, and under questioning, seeing that his employer was about to abandon him, he became very cooperative. The sheriff paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He has signed a full confession, admitting that he was hired by Harlan Pike to stage the stagecoach ambush, to burn the Apache food stores, and to silence Miss Bennett and her companions. It is all right here. He placed a sheaf of papers on the table beside Naila's ring. The confession, the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. The room erupted. Pike's lawyer began to bluster, but his words were lost in the noise. Harlan Pike stood frozen for a moment, his empire of lies crumbling around him. Commissioner Thompson banged a gavel on the table, his face a grim mask. Silence, silence in this hall. He looked at the evidence before him, the photograph, the map, the bullet, the ring, and now, the signed confession. He looked at Pike, then at Abigail and Nantan. In light of this new testimony and evidence, he declared, his voice ringing with authority, "The removal order for the Chiricahua people of this territory is hereby suspended. A full federal investigation will be launched into the business practices of Mr. Harlan Pike and the Arizona Railroad expansion. This hearing is adjourned for 30 days. It was not a complete victory. Pike was not yet in chains. The land was not yet secure, but it was a reprieve. It was a foothold. It was a triumph of a small, hard truth over a great and powerful lie. As the townspeople began to file out of the church, their expressions were no longer uniformly hostile. There was confusion, doubt, and for the first time, in the eyes of a few, a glimmer of respect. The dust of prejudice had not fully settled, but for the first time in a long time, it felt as though the people of Mesquite Crossing might finally be able to see through it. The momentary victory in the church dissolved as quickly as it had formed. Harlan Pike, though publicly exposed, was not a man to be cornered by mere facts. While Commissioner Thompson was attempting to restore order, Pike, under the pretense of conferring with his lawyer, slipped out a side door. He was not a man who trusted in appeals or the slow grind of the law. He trusted in movement, money, and the finality of a long distance. Nantan knew it instinctively. He saw the flicker in Pike's eyes not of defeat, but of calculation. "He is running," he said, his voice a low urgency directed at Sheriff Vale. The sheriff, his face set with a new, hard-won determination, did not hesitate. He will not get far. But Pike had planned his escape. A carriage and 4 fresh horses stood waiting in the alley behind the saloon, along with 3 of his most loyal gunmen. A heavy iron strongbox, containing the incriminating ledgers and the cash to fund his disappearance, was already loaded. By the time Vale and Nantan reached the street, Pike's carriage was a rapidly shrinking cloud of dust on the trail leading west, toward the jagged, labyrinthine maw of Dry Coyote Canyon. There was no time to form an official posse. This was a chase of necessity, a ragged assembly bound by a common purpose. Nantan swung onto his horse, a living extension of the animal. Maria Ortiz was beside him in a flash, her rifle already settled in the crook of her arm. Sheriff Vale, his face grim, mounted his own steady gelding. Abigail, her heart still hammering from the confrontation in the church, ran to the horse Sam Ashby had rented her. This was not over. The story was not finished until the final word was written, and that word was justice. As she mounted, she saw a handful of men from the town moving with purpose toward their own horses. One was the blacksmith, a man whose hands knew the heft of honest work. Another was a farmer whose water rights Pike had tried to strangle. They had sat in the church and listened, and the dust had finally settled from their eyes. They said nothing, but their presence was a verdict. The town was no longer Pike's. The pursuit was a thunder of hooves against the hardpan. They rode hard, a strange collection of lawmen, Apache warrior, vaquera, journalist, and citizens. Pushing their horses into the shimmering heat, the trail climbed, leaving the flat plains behind for the treacherous, broken country that led to the canyon. The dust they raised was a thick, choking fog, coating their clothes and gritting between their teeth. Loose scree clattered under the horses' hooves as they navigated narrow ledges. The canyon floor a dizzying drop below. Abigail rode with a fierce concentration, her body aching, her mind sharp. She watched Nantan, who seemed to read the land itself, anticipating the turns in the trail, his movements fluid and economical. She saw the grim set of Vale's jaw, the look of a man making amends with his own soul, and she felt the fierce, joyful competence of Maria riding beside her, a woman utterly at home in this wild, unforgiving world. They were gaining. Pike's heavy carriage was a liability in this terrain. They could see it now, a dark shape lumbering between the red rock walls. But as they closed the distance, the sky began to change. The pale, washed-out blue turned a sickly yellow-brown. The wind, which had been a hot, steady breath, began to gust and swirl, picking up sand and grit, lashing at them like a whip. Sandstorm Maria yelled, her voice nearly snatched away by the rising wind. It descended upon them with the fury of a biblical plague. The world disappeared into a roaring, blinding vortex of sand. Visibility dropped to less than a horse's length. The sun was obliterated. The air was a thick, suffocating mass that was impossible to breathe. The horses, terrified by the noise and the stinging sand, whinnied and fought against the reins. It was chaos, a primal conflict not against a man, but against the land itself, which had risen up in a fury. Through the maelstrom, a new threat appeared, a lone rider. His face wrapped in a bandana burst through the brown haze. He rode a stolen deputy's horse, and in his hand was a pistol. It was Cain. In the confusion following the hearing, he had made his own escape, his mind burning with a singular, venomous purpose, revenge. He spurred the horse toward the head of their small posse, his eyes wild. But he was not aiming for Nantan or Abigail. He was aiming for the man who had hired him and then left him to hang. Before anyone could react, he fired at Pike's carriage. The shot went wide, but it was enough to spook the lead horses. They screamed and reared, threatening to pull the entire carriage over the side of the narrow ledge. Before Cain could fire again, a single, sharp crack cut through the howl of the wind. It was Maria's rifle. The shot was a piece of artistry in the chaos. Cain's hat flew from his head. A neat, round hole punched through the crown. He clutched at his head, more in shock than in pain, and a second later, the blacksmith, who had been riding close behind, spurred his powerful horse forward, his arm catching Cain in the chest and knocking him from the saddle. He was disarmed and subdued before he hit the ground. "A hot temper!" Maria shouted to no one in particular as she chambered another round. "We'll make you bald." The carriage had tipped precariously, one wheel hanging over the edge of the abyss. Pike and his men had abandoned it, scrambling for cover in the rocks on the high side of the trail. They began firing into the blinding storm, their shots wild and desperate. The world was a confusing nightmare of noise, wind and ricocheting bullets. Abigail, trying to control her panicked horse, found herself near the canyon's rim, the ground crumbling away beneath her feet. Her horse shied violently from a close shot, and the earth gave way. She cried out as she slid, her boots finding no purchase on the loose scree. She was falling toward the edge. A rope snaked out of the brown gloom, the loop settling over her shoulders with impossible accuracy. She felt it tighten, arresting her slide just feet from the drop. Nantan, a ghostly figure in the storm, had dismounted and braced himself, the rope pulled taut in his hands. He was her anchor in the heart of the storm. As he began to pull her back toward solid ground, a figure rose from the rocks. It was Pike, his face a mask of rage and desperation. He raised his pistol and fired. Nantan grunted, his body jolting as if struck by a hammer. He stumbled but did not fall, his grip on the rope never faltering. He pulled Abigail the last few feet onto the ledge, his jaw clenched, his face pale beneath the layer of dust. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his left shoulder. Nantan, Abigail cried, scrambling to his side. "It is nothing," he gritted out, his eyes fixed on the rocks where Pike was hiding. The moment for a strategic retreat was gone. They were trapped on the narrow ledge, pinned down. But Abigail's mind, sharpened by adrenaline, saw an opportunity. The storm was a weapon, if they could only learn how to wield it. She fumbled in her satchel, her fingers closing not on her small camera, but on a spare lens she kept wrapped in chamois cloth. "Sheriff," she yelled, crawling to where Vale was taking cover behind his horse, "when I give the signal, get ready to move." She waited for a lull in the shooting. Then, in a moment when the wind briefly thinned the sand, she saw the faint glint of the sun trying to break through the haze. She held up the lens, angling it, catching the weak light and focusing it into a single, brilliant, blinding flash, aimed directly at the rocks where Pike's men were hiding. For a moment, they were dazzled, their vision filled with a bright, disorienting starburst. It was all the time Vale needed. He moved with a speed that defied his years, his pistol drawn, closing the distance while the gunmen were still blinking away the light. "Drop them," he roared. And the surprised men, their advantage gone, let their weapons clatter to the stone. The final confrontation was between the two men at the heart of the conflict. Pike, seeing his men captured and his escape cut off, made a last, desperate move. He lunged from behind the rocks, not at Vale, but at Nantan, who was still weakened by his wound. It was not a fight with guns, but a raw, physical struggle on the very lip of the canyon. They grappled, two forces of nature locked in combat. Pike, larger and heavier, fought with the wild strength of a cornered animal. Nantan, though injured, fought with a deep, grounded power, his feet planted on the earth he was defending. They swayed back and forth, inches from the precipice, the wind whipping at them, trying to claim them both. Abigail watched, her heart in her throat. Maria had a rifle trained on the fighting men, but could not get a clear shot. Vale was securing the other prisoners. It came down to this, to one man's will against another's. Pike landed a heavy blow to Nantan's wounded shoulder, and Nantan cried out in pain, stumbling backward. For a terrible second, it seemed he would go over the edge, but he used the momentum, twisting, converting the backward fall into a throw. Pike, caught off balance, was thrown forward, landing hard on the rocky ground. Nantan was on him instantly, his knee on Pike's chest, his knife at the man's throat. It was over. Pike lay gasping, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. All Nantan had to do was press the blade. It would be an act of justice, an act of vengeance, an act the land itself seemed to demand. But as he looked down at the man who had tried to destroy his people, Nantan saw not a monster, but just a man, pathetic and defeated. He remembered his promise to Abigail, made in the quiet aftermath of the fire. Justice, not revenge. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the knife. He took the rope he had used to save Abigail and, with quick, efficient motions, bound Pike's hands behind his back. He hauled the railroad tighten to his feet and pushed him towards Sheriff Vale. "This is your prisoner," Nantan said, his voice quiet but carrying with absolute authority over the subsiding wind. He handed the end of the rope to the sheriff, a formal transfer of custody, an affirmation of the law he had chosen to uphold. And as he did so, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sandstorm, its fury spent, began to dissipate. The wind died down to a whisper. The thick, brown curtain of dust parted, revealing a sky of bruised purple and gray. And then a single drop of rain fell, hitting the dusty rock with a small, distinct hiss. It was followed by another, and another. A rare, gentle rain began to fall on dry Coyote Canyon, washing the dust from the air, plastering it to the ground, cleansing the landscape and the weary figures who stood upon it. It was a benediction, a symbol of a new clarity, a promise that after the storm, the truth, like the water, would find its way through the stone. The ride back from Dry Coyote Canyon was a slow, sober procession. The cleansing rain had passed, leaving the air clean and the red earth dark and fragrant. Harlan Pike, bound and silent, rode with a face like thunder-clouded stone. The strongbox, lashed between two horses, was a tangible symbol of his downfall, its iron weight a match for the gravity of his crimes. They were a strange parade returning to Mesquite Crossing, a collection of disparate souls united by the storm they had just weathered, both literal and figurative. The town they returned to was not the same one they had left. The news of Cain's confession and Pike's flight had spread like a brush fire. The whispers of suspicion that had followed Abigail into the church had been replaced by a murmuring curiosity, a dawning awareness that they had been expertly deceived. The sight of Pike being led in ropes to the jail by Sheriff Vale, with Nantan walking tall and wounded beside him, was a powerful and public dismantling of a carefully constructed lie. Federal Commissioner Thompson acted with swift authority, with Cain's confession and the contents of the strongbox, which contained not only money but meticulously kept ledgers detailing bribery and fraudulent land claims. The case was sealed. Within a week, a federal marshal arrived to escort Pike east, to face charges that would dismantle his empire piece by painstaking piece. More importantly, Commissioner Thompson held a second, much quieter public meeting. He formally announced that the executive order for the removal of the Chiricahua Apache was permanently rescinded. The United States government, he declared, would enter into new, fair negotiations with the tribal leaders, with the deerskin map and Naila's testimony serving as the foundation for a new treaty. A fragile, tentative peace, born not of conquest but of truth, began to settle over the territory. A few days after Pike was taken away, Sheriff Enoch Vale walked into the saloon, which was now a far more subdued establishment. He tacked a notice to the wall. It was his letter of resignation. He told the small crowd that had gathered that a town deserved a lawman who saw things clearly from the start, not one who needed a woman with a camera to show him the truth. He had failed in his duty, he said, and he would not carry the badge any longer. A week later, after a town council meeting that lasted long into the night, a new notice was posted. It announced an emergency election for the office of sheriff. There was only one name on the ballot. Enoch Vale won with a unanimous vote. The next morning, he pinned the star back on his chest. When Sam Ashby asked him why he had accepted, Vale simply said, "I figure it is time I did the job right." Abigail spent 2 long days and nights in her room at the boarding house, the smell of photographic chemicals mingling with the scent of ink. She wrote with a feverish intensity, the story pouring out of her not as a sensational headline, but as a complex tapestry of lives. She wrote of the dust and the drought, of shod horse tracks and forged treaties. She wrote of Naila's quiet dignity and Maria's fierce loyalty. She wrote of a lawman's redemption and a railroad built on greed. And she wrote of Nantan, not as a savage, but as a guardian of his people's memory, a man who chose justice when vengeance was his for the taking. She packaged her article with the glass plate negatives of the wheel print and the desecrated burial ground and sent it east with the stagecoach, expecting a letter of termination to be its reply. The response, when it came 3 weeks later, was not a letter, but a package. Inside was a stack of newspapers from Philadelphia. On the front page, under a simple, powerful headline that read, "The Price of Progress in Arizona," was her article, printed in its entirety, her photographs, rendered as beautiful. stark engravings, were given a place of honor. Her editor had included a short, handwritten note. It said, "Only. You were right. We will do better." The story of the clean railroad became a subject of debate and fascination back east, a cautionary tale that complicated the simple narrative of manifest destiny. Abigail had not just reported a story, she had changed it. As the season turned and the fierce heat of summer began to yield to the crispness of autumn, Naila sent word that there would be a ceremony at the spring, the one that had been burned and desecrated. It was a ceremony of thanks for the rain that had come after the sandstorm, a rain that had begun to fill the dry wells and revive the parched land. The entire Chiricahua community gathered, their faces solemn and hopeful. Abigail was invited to attend. She stood respectfully at the edge of the circle as Naila sang a low, ancient song, her voice weaving a story of water and endurance. The people passed a gourd of cool, clear water, each person taking a sip and offering a silent prayer. When the gourd came to Naila, she did not drink. She walked across the circle to where Abigail stood. She held the gourd out to her. Abigail hesitated for a moment, then accepted it, lifting it to her lips and drinking the sweet, life-giving water. When she was done, Naila took her hand. The old woman tied a simple, woven bracelet of yucca fiber around Abigail's wrist. It was not a gift of thanks. It was a mark of kinship, a quiet, profound acknowledgement that she was no longer an outsider. She was a woman who had helped bring the water back. Maria Ortiz, meanwhile, had found a new and disruptive purpose in the revitalized town. With a small loan from a suddenly more civic-minded town council, she took over the old livery stable and started a riding school. Her students were the children of the town, sons and daughters of ranchers, blacksmiths, and merchants. And, after a week of Maria's indomitable persuasion, a handful of curious Apache children who rode down from the canyon, she taught them all with the same mix of tough discipline and sharp humor. Abigail once saw her watching a young boy struggle to stay on a spirited pony. She had shouted, "Keep your heels down. Muchacho, the horses listen to your legs, not your big ideas. Children know how to stay in the saddle better than most of the big-talking men in this town." The bullet had passed cleanly through the muscle of Nantan's shoulder, a painful but not a disabling wound. In the quiet evenings, Abigail would clean and dress it for him. They fell into a comfortable routine, their conversations soft and spare in the fading light. During one of these evenings, as she was carefully wrapping a fresh bandage, he spoke of his parents, of the family he had lost. Abigail listened, her hands never ceasing their gentle work. "My father was a blacksmith," she said quietly. "He taught me that you can mend almost anything if you have patience and the right tools, but I think family is different. I do not think it is something you are just born with. I think it is something you build." She finished tying the bandage and finally met his gaze. "It is the choice you make, every day, to care for another person, to be their strength when they are wounded." He looked at the bandage on his shoulder, then at the faded yucca bracelet on her wrist. He reached out with his good hand and gently touched the woven fibers. He said nothing, but his touch was a language all its own, an acknowledgement of the family they were building together, forged not in blood, but in shared danger and mutual respect. He no longer spoke of the guilt he carried from his time as a scout, the path he had walked, the one that had caused him so much pain, had ultimately led him here, to this moment, to the salvation of his people in a way he never could have imagined. He had not betrayed his past, he had fulfilled it. And Abigail, who had once feared that her feelings would cloud her judgment and betray her professional integrity, now understood the truth. Her love for this man and his people had not blinded her. It had been the very thing that had allowed her to see clearly, the lens that had brought the entire, complicated, beautiful picture into sharp focus. Love did not obscure the truth. It was a fierce and powerful guardian of it. The red dust still blew through the streets of Mesquite Crossing when the wind was high. Prejudice and old habits did not vanish overnight, but something had fundamentally changed. A new irrigation ditch, dug by the men of the town and the men of the canyon working side by side. now ran from the revived spring, bringing a thin, steady stream of water to the parched fields of both communities. The dust still hung in the air, a reminder of the blindness that had once prevailed. But now, down on the ground, the water was flowing. Trust had a channel. Hope had a path. The wheels of federal justice, once set in motion, ground slowly but with an inexorable force. The trial of Harlan Pike was a distant affair, a matter of telegraph reports and newspaper columns that trickled back to Mesquite Crossing weeks after the fact. But the verdict was unequivocal, convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and bribery. Pike's empire of deceit was dismantled, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of Washington. The railroad, under new, more scrupulous management, was rerouted. The survey stakes were pulled from the sacred burial grounds, and the line of steel was shifted south, its path now guided by respect rather than avarice. As part of the legal settlement, a substantial fund was established, managed jointly by the territorial government and tribal representatives, dedicated to ensuring the equitable distribution of water rights for the entire region. The victory was quiet, but it was complete. The truth, like water, had worn a new path through the stone of power. With the main conflict resolved, Abigail found herself at a crossroads. Her editor, in his letter of commendation, had offered her a prestigious position back east, a chance to write editorials, to be a respected voice in the civilized world. She read his offer in the shade of the boarding house porch, the red dust of Mesquite Crossing settling on the fine paper. She looked out at the street, at the slow, steady rhythm of life. She saw the blacksmith's son walking with one of Naila's grandsons, pointing at a lizard on the wall. She heard the laughter from Maria's riding school. She felt the dry, honest heat of the sun on her skin, and she knew she was already home. She wrote back to her editor, respectfully declining his offer. She proposed instead to become the paper's first permanent frontier correspondent, to write not about the sensational clashes of civilization and savagery, but about the slow, difficult, and beautiful process of a community being born. She would write about the complexities of water rights, the challenges of creating a school for children of two cultures, the long, arduous journeys of traveling doctors and mail carriers. Her editor, perhaps sensing that he was getting the better story after all, agreed. Abigail Bennett had found her beat. On the days she was not writing, she started a small class of her own, in the afternoons, in the cool of the church hall. She taught a handful of Apache and immigrant children how to read, how to write their own names, how to see the world not just with their eyes, but through the lens of a camera, how to capture their own small, vital truths. Nantan, in turn, found himself walking a new path. The man who had once been a scout, a silent guide on the edges of the white man's world, was now being asked to be a voice. The Chiricahua, seeing the trust he had built with Sheriff Vale and the townspeople, appointed him their official liaison. He attended the town council meetings, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the promises that had been made. He spoke of grazing rights and trade, his words spare but carefully chosen, translating not just a language, but a way of seeing the world. He was no longer a man caught between two worlds, but a bridge that connected them, a role he accepted with the same solemn gravity with which he had accepted his duty to protect his people. One late afternoon, as the sun began to cast long, golden shadows, he came to find Abigail by the new irrigation ditch, the small channel of water. A silver thread in the red earth gurgled softly, a sound of life and promise. They stood for a long time without speaking, listening to the water, watching it nourish the thirsty soil. The scent of damp earth and wild sage filled the air. "This water?" Nantan said, his voice as soft as the evening light. "It flows because we trusted, because you saw the truth in the dirt." "And you saw the truth in me," she replied, her gaze meeting his. He reached up and, with a slow, deliberate motion, untied the dark kerchief from his neck. It was the same cloth that had once been a symbol of his vow, the same cloth that had cooled the burn on her wrist. He held it not as a bandage, but as an offering, He took her left hand, the one with the faded yucca bracelet, and gently, reverently, wrapped the soft cloth around her wrist, over the woven fibers. He did not tie a knot, but tucked the ends in, a secure but not a binding hold. "In my people's way," he said, his voice a low murmur, "some bonds are tied to hold a person fast, but that is not the bond I seek with you." He looked into her eyes, and in their dark, steady depths, she saw a future. "We tie a promise," he said, his fingers brushing against hers. "We do not tie a freedom." It was not a question, but a statement, a declaration as elemental and true as the earth beneath their feet. Abigail felt tears well in her eyes, tears of a joy so profound it was almost a form of peace. She did not need to speak her answer. It was in the way she leaned into him, the way her hand turned to clasp his. It was in the shared silence that was more intimate than any words. Their wedding was not held in the church, but in the open air, on the land that belonged to everyone and no one. The guests were a tapestry of the new West Chiricahua families in their finest beaded buckskin, ranchers in their Sunday best, Sam Ashby from the boarding house, and a reformed Sheriff Vale, who stood as Nantan's witness. Maria Ortiz, standing on a slightly too tall wooden crate so everyone could see her, acted as the officiant. She spoke not of scripture, but of the stubbornness of weeds, the loyalty of a good horse, and the courage it takes to trust someone in a land that is mostly thorns. When she reached the end of her short, heartfelt, and entirely unofficial ceremony, she grinned. "Well," she declared to the assembled crowd, "by the authority vested in me by absolutely no one, I say you are bound. Now, Nantan, you are supposed to kiss your bride." She paused, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "And if you do not, I will kiss the horse." Laughter rolled through the small crowd, a warm, shared sound that bridged all divides. Nantan turned to Abigail. The setting sun lit her hair, and her eyes shone with a love that was as steady and sure as the mountains behind them. He leaned in, and in a moment of profound respect for the privacy of a bond so deeply forged, the world saw only the meeting of two souls, a quiet promise fulfilled. They built their life together, a partnership as strong and resilient as the land itself. The red dust still blew on windy days, a reminder of the blindness and prejudice that could so easily obscure the truth. But the water in the new ditch continued to flow, a constant, quiet testament to what they had accomplished. In a land where dust could blind, they chose to be the ones who opened each other's eyes. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video. And press the hype button to help this story reach more people.